Good. I mean, I don't think I really need an introduction. Most of the people here already know you, I presume, well, but it actually gives me great pleasure to introduce you. So if you don't mind, I'm going to say a couple of words. Also, for those of you who don't know you, I think I shouldn't presume. So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the penultimate talk for this year. So we're very, very pleased this afternoon to have Dr. Petra Sijpesteijn, who's a professor of Arabic at Leiden University. She studied Arabic and history at Leiden, Cambridge, Damascus, Cairo, and Princeton, where we first met, where you got your degree from there in 2004. But before that, obviously.
I think during the selection.
Yes.
Events.
Yeah. When I was exiting.
Yeah.
The research concentrates on recovering the experiences of Muslims and non-Muslims living under Islamic rule, using the vast stores of radically underused documents, the papyri, which are now synonymous with Petra's name, from the early Islamic world. She's the author of numerous books, articles, and book chapters, whose subject matter is a clear testimony to her erudition and wide-ranging interests. Her books range from shaping a Muslim state, the world of a mid-8th century Egyptian official. Naturally, I go to 18, I have to be going back a millennium earlier, which was published in 2013, to Why Arabic, in which she shows what can be gained by engaging with this wonderful language. But it's actually her articles and book chapters that are show this amazing range of topics and interests. They cover topics as wide and as big as the Arab conquest of Egypt and the beginning of Muslim rule, to landholding patterns in early Islamic Egypt, to articles as talismans, seals and papyri, monastic estates, policing and prisons, buying silk and shaving hair and beards. So it's a wide range of fascinating interests. And her talk today, as you can see, is petitions to government in early Islamic Egypt, government officials in early Islamic Egypt. Petra, it's a pleasure to have you, and we very much look forward to your talk.
Thank you, Khaled. Yeah, so I guess every person who comes to talk here says the same thing. This is my first real talk, live again, wonderful. But it is for me as well. So, oh, sorry. Yes. So I wrote out my talk because I was also getting about that. So I know the material, I think, well enough that I might paraphrase things. But now I stand in front of the screen for those who are here. Doesn't matter?
No, you're okay.
You're okay.
All conceded. It's good.
Okay.
Wonderful.
Right. Okay. So I will paraphrase, but also, you know, we're close and informal enough. I think that if there's anything that you want to hear more about, just ask me, or something that's not clear. And it's very nice of Khaled to have invited me here and to introduce me this way. But of course, I'm super pleased that Jeffrey is sitting here, because I think for me, that's why I came to Cambridge. And for me, he is synonymous with the Arabic papyri. And I was just saying today that what's especially nice, I mean, we will see here, papyri, of course, you just turn over. These documents were not written for us and nicely organized in archives and topics. They're just the letters and the documents that people wrote and then threw away. So each papyrus that you pick up deals with another topic. And this is also why it goes in every direction, because you never know what's in there. And by the time you spend your time trying to read it, you're not going to put it away without publishing it. So that's why it becomes very diverse. Anyway, I'm very glad to be here. Thank you, Khaled. And thank you, Neil, for organizing everything so smoothly. So, and it's wonderful to be here in this green and is that flourishing, blooming Cambridge. But we're going to go to the dry deserts of Egypt and Cairo, and to a little bit unpleasant things, petitions. So let's dive straight in. First papyrus, actually, Gebet al-Mirt is in Palestine, yeah, near Jerusalem. So sometime between 650 and 700 of the Common Era, a woman called Iyas, and I'll put the text up here, but I also listen to me, don't be too distracted. To try to read it all, I'm going to tell you the story. So called Iyas, daughter of Muarik, approached Der, son of Abdallah, to complain about her husband, who had appropriated her possessions, mata, and withheld the money for her maintenance, nafaka. Der sent the woman with an accompanying letter mentioning what she had told him to someone called Omar ibn Abdallah, asking him to call in Iyas's husband, confront him with his wife's claim, and decide whether her claim was grounded, and if so, give her back her things and restore the payment of her nafaka. So we're 650, huh? Or second half of the 7th century, very close to Muhammad and the conquest, etc. So in a papyrus that was found in Gebet al-Mirt, a monastery close to Jerusalem, so that's this actual letter, Omar, the one who had been sent the wife and the letter, now reports back to his superior called Der. And this is the letter, and you can indeed read here the address. Basmala for those of you. Lider ibn Abdallah min Omar ibn Ubaydallah. So that's the beginning, the address. I brought, so what does he say? I brought the two, sorry, go back here. So what does he write back? How does he report back on the case that was forwarded to him? He says, I brought the two together in front of me, and I confronted him, that's to say the husband, with her, that's the wife's claim. He acknowledged her possessions and returned them to her, but he refused to pay her maintenance. Then the woman asked me that I forward him with her to you. So back to Dir, where it all started. So I did, and I ordered both of them to go to you. Now I write you so that you order me to execute what you decide in their case. So about the last bit, about this nafaka. So this letter is a great way into the theme of my talk today, namely how people in the early Islamic Empire solved their problems, what venues were available to them, especially in the realm of public institutions, what procedures were in place to handle cases presented by individual petitioners, and what this tells us about legal and administrative practices and procedural rules in place at this very early period, and how they relate to pre-Islamic institutions and later Islamic legal practices. There's a lot of, I said, questions and topics, but I'm basically interested in people have a problem, how do they solve it with the aid of government officials? And what does that tell us about standardized practices being in place in this early, the first 100 years of the 200 years of the Muslim Empire. And I'm purposely looking from a bottom-up perspective, which is firstly determined by my evidence. I work with documents written on papyrus, which contain the letters sent by petitioners or epistles recording their cases and how they were dealt with, as we just heard. There is, however, also a methodological point to this. And I've been greatly inspired in this aspect by the work on legal pluralism and so-called forum shopping, mainly the work of Uri Simonsen for the early period, who looked at where Christian and Jewish inhabitants of the early Muslim Empire took their law cases, especially why and when they took them to a Muslim Qadi, but especially also by the work of Caroline Humphreys, who's a Byzantine lawyer, whose insight into the late Roman legal arena as one where top-down decisions about the organization of the law were matched by bottom-up lawmaking processes initiated by the users of the law. Their choices and preferences, their adjustments and manipulations of legal frameworks, in other words, how people who used the law had impacted the form of the legal system. And of course, I also have been inspired by the work, very important work done on petitions by Mathieu Tellier, Jeffrey Kahn, Marina Rustov, Jean-Luc Fournet, Maaike van Berkel, also on Mazalem courts. So now let's return to our letter and take a closer look at what's going on here. So we have a married woman, Iyas, who feels mistreated by her husband, who she claims took possession of her property and who also refuses to pay for her living costs or that of the household she's running, and for which he is presumably the breadwinner. So based on the woman's name, mother of Iyas, we can assume that there were also children in the household, although such kunyas can of course also have other meanings. So we can imagine that Iyas, so she has a conflict with her husband, so that she first confronted her husband directly about the misconduct she experienced from him. But when that didn't solve the issue, she might have approached some authoritative figures in her environment or that of her husband's. This presumably also did not lead to the desired result, either because her husband was not sensitive to their interference or because she did not find a suitable ally to her case. And we can talk about this later, but there are many reasons why people might go to a government official. And one of them is to kind of go to an outside neutral terrain, because exactly when you're in a conflict with your husband, you might not want to go to the neighbor who plays cards every week with your husband. So next, she turned to a representative of the authorities. Dir ibn Abdallah's function is not stated in the letter. But Mathieu Tellier, who also used this letter in his detailed and excellent examination of petition procedures in Sufyanid and Marwanid Egypt and Palestine, already identified him probably as the same one, Dir ibn Abdallah al-Khawlani, who is known to have been appointed at the end of the 7th century as the governor or wali of Jerusalem. So, and elsewhere it's stated that this same Dir ibn Abdallah al-Khawlani is also said to have participated in the raids of Malik ibn Abdallah, who is also known as Malik al-Sawa'if, which he undertook in the 60s of the Hijrah, that's 680 of the Common Era, into Byzantine lands. So that's quite nice. I was saying before that the papyri are actually mostly deal with people you never heard of, but in this case we actually, we're not entirely sure, but I think we can identify him in this way. And Dir ibn Abdallah is described in biographical works as belonging to, in order of increasing precision, Min Ahl al-Sham, so the people of Syria, of Palestine, or of Jerusalem, Min Ahl Bayt al-Maqdis. So this at least places him in the right period and place as our papyrus. So Dir heard Iyas and decided to delegate the case to Omar ibn Ubaydallah. So there we go. Omar's function is also not mentioned in the letter, and I could not identify any of the historical, in any of the historical sources. I couldn't identify him in Umayyad al-Sham, but we can assume that he was a lower administrative official in the same area, presumably in the place where Iyas and her husband resided. So Iyas brought the letter from Dir saying that Omar should look into the case herself. And it says in the letter, as you might remember, you sent, so Omar, who receives the letter and who's now reporting back to Dir, says in his letter, you sent a letter with Iyas, katabta ma'a Iyas. So this is exactly what's happening. So Omar then brings the husband and wife together to decide whether Iyas' story was true, or to rather to listen to the husband what he had to say. Presumably some judicial procedure followed, such as presenting evidence and witnesses. And the defendant, as I said, had to respond to the plaintiff's claim. In this process, the husband acknowledged that he had illegitimately taken the wife's property and returned it. However, he denied that he should pay her sustenance, or he refused to pay it to her. This could have been the end of the story. The wife's claim concerning her property was validated, but her claim concerning her living costs was not. Case closed. The wife, however, the letter states, insisted that Dir, the governor of Jerusalem, would take another look at her case. So does this constitute actually a case of appeal? In other words, Iyas was not satisfied with the outcome of her case, insisting on a second hearing. Or was it actually Omar who was unable to decide fully whether her claim was true, or was just not able to decide it, or not able to get something out of the husband? So rather than using more time and effort to find out whether the claim was valid, he, at Iyas's suggestion, sends both of them to the governor to have him decide. In any case, the wife and husband have been told to go to the governor. And remember how Omar had let us know in his letter that before it had been Iyas who had brought the letter from his superior, carrying instructions on what to do. Now, in his letter, Omar, so he writes the letter independently of the husband and wife. So he sends the husband and wife back to Dir, and then he sends a letter to Dir independently. And this, I think, is quite interesting, but it compares really well with what we have, what Eva Grob has said so nicely about how merchants use letters. So what they would often do is send the materials that they wanted to transfer to a commercial partner or something, and then send a letter independently, which could be used as a check, right? The merchant receives the goods and then checks in the letter what he was supposed to receive. So I think something similar is happening here. So in this way, the couple cannot actually take in the letter and decide for whatever reason or one of the two to not pursue the case anymore. So, and then Omar in his letter asks Dir to let him know again what he has decided in the Nafaka case, right? What has come out of the payment of the maintenance, in case he has to do something related to that again, so that he can execute the verdict. So what can we conclude on the basis of this letter? I think, first of all, we are dealing here in this very early period with a well-established procedure of dealing with litigation cases. A plaintiff approaches a government official who then delegated the examination of the case to a lower official with more direct access to the details of the case, and most importantly, who was present at the place where the defendant was located, because they had, the defendant had to be, in this case, the husband, had to be brought in, of course. In other words, the administrator who had jurisdiction over the place of residency of the defendant. And we see this all the time. So a judicial procedure involving both plaintiff and defendant determined then whether the plaintiff's claim was justified or valid, and in which case, the abuse or the problem that had been caused had to be restored, the goods given back, the stolen goods, whatever the claim had been, and possibly additional fines or penalties for the culprit. But we don't have actually kind of the report, we don't have notes from the proceedings or something. Another important feature is that the lower placed official had to report back to his superior. So a case is delegated to a lower official, the lower official has to deal with it and has to report back to the higher official. So it's all quite a sophisticated system. So cases brought before the state officials could deal with marital problems, such as the case we've just examined. And what's also important is that in our case, the plaintiff, in our case, Iyas, could exercise quite some power about how the case was dealt with. She brought her case to the attention of Dir in the first place, supposedly of her own volition, like she decided who was going to help her solve this problem with her husband. And she asked in second instance that Omar hand over the case to Dir again when it was not solved to her satisfaction. And needless to say, we also don't know who Iyas is, but from all this, I think we can say she's either, quite a powerful, person and didn't give up. That's more like characteristics, I guess, but she must have also had some clout, I think, to ask these officials to do these things. But just as Iyas most probably examined other venues before turning to Dir to solve her problem, similar conflicts between husband and wife did not always end up before the authorities. So as I reconstructed it, Iyas probably first did a few other things before she ended up with the authorities. And so we have actually an example of how this happened in another case. So this is a bit later letter. It's probably from the 9th century. Also, this one is from Egypt. In this case, it is the wife that took possessions of the husband, and she left their house, taking his stuff with him. And in this case, so the husband claims abuse. He's the plaintiff. And he delivers the letter, and that's the papyrus letter we're looking at. So this is the letter that the husband, having complained to someone, is taking. So he's bringing this letter, and the letter states his claim to the person. Unfortunately, the names of the addressees are lost, of the sender and the addressee are lost. So, but this letter states, summarizes his claim again, and he brings it to the person who will hopefully help him to get his rights, solve his conflict with his wife, get his stuff back, and probably, I assume, also his wife. So as it says in the letter, the person bringing this letter told me that his wife left their house, taking his things. The husband is weak, and he's weak. So he writes that in support, trying to convince the addressee to help the husband. And this is in some way a standardized language of petition letters. It is also, I think, taking it outside of the public sphere and probably more into the private sphere. So outside the judicial or administrative realm. But on the other hand, he also uses a very polite request formula. So that's, the stuff that Jeffrey Kahn analyzed. And this is a very well-known polite request formula, which is used in petitions. And that formula, which is in a way this very polite and extensive, elaborate formulation, points, I think, at least at a more some social distance between the sender and the addressee. It's not, they're not writing to a friend, a close friend, or a family member, or some other close relation. So although it's not to a government official per se, it's also not to the direct neighbor. And finally, it is of course interesting that this letter too, although it dates from a much later period and supposedly from the private and not the public realm, in other words, not sent to a government official, but to someone outside the bureaucracy, shows a kind of appeal procedure and a delegation procedure. The sender of this letter heard the poor husband's case and forwarded his problem in written form together with the plaintiff to someone who had better access to restore the husband's misappropriation and to solve his problem with his wife. So, but on the other hand, there's no mention of investigation, bringing the parties together to decide on the validity of the plaintiff's claim. We don't know how the addressee is going to solve this case. So in the same way that we can only speculate that Iyas first turned to people in her environment to solve her marital conflict before she ended up with the governor of Jerusalem, we can state that it would of course be possible for the poor husband in this case to turn with his case to a government official as well, or to some other state representative somewhere in the process or at this stage. And again, it's something to think about, and we can talk about it, why people chose one venue over another. But my point is that people had different options to solve their problems. And in this case, it's in a way like a similar problem, right? Different people and different venues to turn to, and they moved between them. And I will return to this point. So we have more documents that confirm that there was indeed this exact procedure in place that I mentioned with delegation, etc. So a really nice place to look for this are the letters from the governor Qura ibn Sharik. He served as governor from 709 to 715 of the Common Era. And amongst the governor's letters are large numbers sent to heads of districts, so-called pagarchs. So there are many to a certain Basilios, pagarch of Ishqun, Aphrodito in Upper Egypt, but also to Zachariah, pagarch of Ashmun, also in Upper Egypt, and to Mina, pagarch of Ehnas, which is at the current Banu Suef. So Qura's letters are now found all over the world. Many are kept in the British Museum, but there are also several in Chicago, Heidelberg, Vienna, and Istanbul. In this letter, which Qura sends to Mina, the Christian head of the district of Ehnas, as I already said, currently Banu Suef, but ancient in the Greek, it was called Herakleopolis. And he sends this letter about a certain Qusta, an Egyptian Christian. So Mina should help Qusta to obtain his right, as it says, if he has any, in kana lahu. Very short way of saying it. So the letter is written, as it says at the bottom, Bisana Tisain, and that's 709 of the Common Era. And in this case, I mean, I only cited one letter, but it's actually very short. So it just says, you know, I said that help Costa the Costa, and help him to obtain his right if he in kana lahu. Istikhraj haq in kana lahu. So very short, very limited information. So we can be fairly sure, I think, that Qusta brought this letter as well from Qura to Mina. Because there's not even a summary of the problem that he has, let alone the person he has the problem with. Qusta has to come along and explain all that. So, but we can reconstruct the procedure again as follows. Qusta had a problem involving someone or some situation in the district of Ehnas. He didn't go to the pagarch of Ehnas, no, he had to go to the governor Qura ibn Sharik, who delegated the issue to his subordinate, Mina, pagarch of Ehnas. And to just be sure, I mean, we don't have similar letters from pagarchs, yeah? So we really, there must have been this thing like, if you have a problem, you go to the governor, he sends it down to the lower officials. So Qusta's claim is examined to the governor in some way, like is it acceptable, is it eligible? He then writes to the lower official, and if his claim is legitimate, his right is restored. Qusta brings the letter himself to the pagarch so that he can make his case. And if the identity of the defendant in our previous letter, so between the wife and the husband, might have been established, even though it's not written out, the defendant is only called the husband, her husband, but we might think like, well, okay, you know, they're in this town, and who is the husband of Iyas? You might still be able to find it. But as I said here, there's no mention of the defendant at all. So I think this confirms that the plaintiff was present at the official delegating their case in a letter that they then carried themselves to the lower official appointed to deal with their complaint. And interesting, as I already said, Qusta is described as a so-called Qustal. So good Arabic word. No, not really. It comes from the Latin, and it is it's a financial official, so transcribed into Arabic. So he was an official in charge of handling money for the authorities. He collected taxes, fines, other payments were all dealt with him. So we wonder, whether this had something to do with it. As we saw in the other letter, titles are normally not mentioned. So it's quite interesting that he is identified as this financial official. And perhaps it's a way, just as I said, like, throwing in this word, he is weak. Perhaps this is a way to make Mina move in a certain way, right? He's a costal. In other letters by which Korah, when he deals with complaints, he says other things, but for example, he asks for bayana, which is very nice for those of us who have looked at legal documents from other periods. That's a very technical term, right? So these letters date though from the early 8th century. And we have it already. So bayana is in letters from Korah, and also in this one actually comes from an even earlier one from the year 65 Hijra. So there already you have these technical legal terms used. The plaintiff has to present evidence, and if they present evidence, in this case it's also a woman, restore the right to her haq. So we have this very interesting letter from the 7th century in which someone writes in reaction to a complaint of a group of people. So he writes to a lower official, again, it's the same procedure. A group of peasants came to me complaining, a group of people came to me complaining about these peasants. And the word is anbat, which nabati, anbat comes up a lot in these complaints, which is another interesting issue. But they refuse to pay the jizya. And jizya, we know, of course, is the word for poll tax. At this time, it can be actually any kind of tax paid in coin. And they have behaved improperly, it says as well, like they've been impolite. So help them, that's the people who have come to complain. They're probably landowners, big landowners, where these guys are living, perhaps, not able to move. We don't know exactly in this early period how that was organized. But for some reason, these people who came to complain were responsible for these peasants living on the land, and get them their right, restore their right to them. And again, the person, the lower official, has to report back in writing to the higher official who has forwarded to him this case. Now, we have another case of also, so these previous plaintiffs were, they were not government officials, but they were collecting the taxes. So they had also some kind of official function, right? So they also have to go through this procedure. Now we have someone called Leiden ibn Muslim. So that's the 8th century official that I wrote the book about. And in this case, super interesting, he is a plaintiff. He comes as a plaintiff, but as a private individual. So he has actually the governor. He has complained to the governor. The governor writes to a lower official of a district, min ahl ardika, so from your land, from your district, someone from your district has caused him, has abused him. What has he done? Najid bought something, this other person took it in some way. So again, make sure that you restore his right and that there's no Muslim, no injustice. Now, of course, we have here officials or people connected to the government who are complaining about abuse they've experienced. But we have, of course, also the other way around. So we have abusive officials. So this is a fantastic letter from Nassana in the Negev desert, published by Robert Hoyland. And it is a rebuke by someone so his name is there, but we cannot, his name is Bayan Ahmed Qais. Again, his title is not mentioned. Robert thinks he is a governor. He is scolding two tax collectors, two officials, over some issue of money, some embezzlement, some fraud, abuse of taxpayers in this case. And so he's saying, you know, you're behaving, again, zulm is used, you know, you're behaving a facade, a destruction, where, you know, we're not accepting this. And you have to acknowledge the dhimma of these people, the protection that these people fall under, the dhimmat Allah wa dhimmat Rasulullah. So the protection of God and of God's prophet. This is actually, by the way, the earliest mention of, not Muhammad, but the prophet by his title. Now, this one is amazing also. So again, we have abusive officials here. And here we see a different way of, the previous one was the governor sending a letter to abusive officials. So we can imagine taxpayers having approached the governor. He deals with this problem by sending a letter to them. Don't behave in this way. In this case, we have some taxpayers who have approached the governor. And what he does is he sends two people down to the district to the Fayoum to order all the people who have been involved in the tax payment to come together, because these two officials have with them a letter of abuses which have been reported. So we have here a little bit of a different procedure. People have brought a complaint to the governor. He sends about abusive taxpayers, tax collectors. He sends down two representatives with the order to look after, as it says, to protect them from these kind of abuses, to treat them well. And it's interesting, he uses ra'ya, so the flock, which is also a very loaded term, or how you say that, like specific term, of course, for the subjects, already with this idea of protection. The ruler has to protect the subjects. So here and of course we can understand in a way it's the same procedure. Plaintiffs go to the governor, governor deals with the issue, but in this case he can of course not tell the local official to deal with it, because the local official is part of the problem. He's the defendant basically, so he sends two other people to deal with it. And one more example of that, and by the way these are all from the 8th century, 8th and 7th century. So here also, how is that? The governor has heard about complaints, in this case about a specific guy, Abdul Wahid, son of Qais, and he tells now the local official, I've sent this other guy, Al-Harith ibn Kamel, to help you to deal with the complaints that have been raised against this guy. So again, you know, complaints comes to the governor. He has different ways of dealing with it. He can tell the local district official, you deal with it with a letter. In this case, he also sends someone from the capital to help with it. And why is that? Well, we can imagine, you know, from the previous letter, we might have the impression that, and of course it differs per case, that this governor and his representatives really want to set straight some abuse, some problematic situation. But the outcome of this kind of, let's look into the complaint against the government official, might also be this one. So this is a really famous letter or document. It's more than 2 meters long. It's now in the Dar al-Kutub in Cairo. And it's written in 3 languages, dates from 757, 758. So after the Abbasid takeover, you can say, written in Greek, Coptic, and Arabic. What is it? It is a document where the most important inhabitants of Ahmim and Tahta, I think it also says, but anyway, have been summoned together by a representative of the governor. So a bit of the same situation, to declare that the complaint they had about a government official, they withdraw it. So here you can see what the outcome could have been, right? These local guys complain about an abusive official to the governor. The governor sends someone. Actually, it says, you know, you sent us someone, and we're accepting that. And he has actually, there does seem to be some restitution of rights. I think I put it even here, dikaios. No, he has given us a right. So we can even think of, you know, they've claimed they've made a complaint. The guy has been confronted with this complaint. This is Amar ibn Attas. He has acknowledged perhaps some guilt, given back some stuff, and now these people who had the plaintiffs have to make a declaration that they're all okay with him. And even more that if ever they raise a complaint after this, they will have to pay a fine. So, you know, perhaps in the previous or two previous letters where these two guys were sent down and they said, you come here and I have this letter with terrible complaints. And we think, oh, they're really going to deal with it. This could also be the outcome. Okay, now we've all dealt now with litigation cases brought before the government officials, but there are also other cases that are brought there. So we have here a nice letter that Jeffrey published, and this is written to an Amir, so definitely government official, right? But it is a guy who talks about the taxes that they have to start to pay. And he says, yeah, there's some problem with the taxes we have to pay this year because we've had really bad luck. There's been disease, we've been imprisoned, which prevented us from working the land. And now it's all wasted. And then he just says at the end, you know, so please look into our case again. Interestingly enough, he doesn't say what he wants. Does he want alms? I mean, he says, right? Some of us don't even have anything to eat. Does he want alms? Does he want a lower tax payment? Does he want postponement of the tax payment? I think here too, there was probably someone accompanying this letter, in this case, so not the delegation, but the petition, the actual petition, the request letter, to explain more about the case, right? You sent a letter, and we're talking about that, the status of writing, but anyway, you sent a letter, but you also sent someone along who can answer questions about exactly the case, etc. But we also have other kinds of requests made to petitions sent to government officials. So here's someone who just writes, so Ana Gharib, you know, I'm a stranger, I'm like a new immigrant in this city, I'm lost. I don't have anyone except God and the Qa'id, the commander. And unfortunately, it's broken off there. The whole, it's quite a long letter. I mean, the part that's preserved, but it's all praises on the Qa'id. And then when he comes to the point, it's broken off. So we don't know what he exactly wanted. Did he want money? Did he want a job? Did he want any other favor? We can assume that he explained it when he delivered it. And this one is a very nice one. So this woman writes that she is a armala miskina. Laysa laha ahad illa, there's something missing, but anyway, there's a walad, she has a son, and she lives, this is talking about herself, ta'ish billah wa bihi. So she relies on God and on her son. But now the son has been taken and put in prison. So she writes to the Amir, again to an Amir, she writes to an Amir, but we don't really know what she wants again. Does she want alms? She also says, you know, I haven't met anyone who's giving me even a piece of bread. Does she want alms? Does she want money? Does she want the Amir to help get her son out of prison? We don't know. But the interesting thing is, of course, that these people calling themselves poor widows are turning to government officials with their petitions. So I see the clock there behind, so I'm getting a bit. So if we want to understand these, so we find, in short, you know, we find Muslims, Christians, government officials, private individuals turning to government officials with litigation cases of financial concern, unidentified problems, marital problems, and we have a procedure. You turn to the government, who delegates to lower officials, Christian and Muslim pay guards or other functionaries at the head of a district where the defendant and the plaintiff are located, who then dealt with it. And this is about the litigation cases, right? So the ones we talked about in the beginning. And I think it's quite important for these litigation cases, we don't have similar petitions like the ones we just saw, I should go perhaps better, like these ones, from people who have a problem with another individual. So we don't have, I have an issue with this other guy, please help my case, from this early period. But we have a lot of documents that refer to these claims being made to them, right? Complaints. So I think that why we don't have these petitions in writing to government officials in litigation cases, I think is because these people would make their claims orally at the government offices. I already said, you know, there's definitely the plaintiff is present and he has a role to play conveying the information about the case to the person who's actually going to deal with it. So I think similarly, he reported on his case and made his claim orally. Yeah, and as you will see later on, I think also these other cases in the early period, these kind of petitions were actually in the earlier period also made orally, because I forgot to tell you, but all these petitions about other kinds of cases, so the stranger, this Armala, this widow, and the first one, the bad harvest, they all date to the 9th century. We have one other one about the bad harvest from the 2nd century, but they date to a later period. Yeah. Okay. So we have many other of these letters from the petitions from the 9th century onwards about all sorts of topics. Someone writes, restore, and my name is falsely included in this register. You have to take it out. Someone says, please send me some money so I can buy myself and my daughter out of slavery. These are from the 9th century and both sent to government officials. And as we have been seeing, the problem is in identifying who these things are sent to and whether they are government officials or not, is because most of the individuals don't carry a title. So we don't actually know what their position is. We can, you know, the ones that I included, the petitions I included because they are actually all directed at people who are only identified, Amir, only identified by their title. So it's a bit the other way around from the other documents we looked at, but that's because in this case, I cannot use the procedure to identify this as a government issue. So in fact, I think that there might be many more documents sent to government officials which are only addressed by their name. Yeah. So, yeah, we don't have letters dealing with these kind of other cases that are not litigation cases. As we saw at the beginning, litigation cases brought before the governor are then delegated to a lower official to deal with. But we don't have things like this. We don't have, there was a Armala Meskina who came to see me, now you deal with her case. There's a man who's new in this town, please look after him. These kind of cases where there's not an opponent, there's not a defendant, we don't see them being delegated. So why would that be? Well, I think it's because there's only one party involved. So you don't need to bring the defendant in to confront the two. and you don't need to turn to someone in the place where the defendant is resident. So the person who receives this letter, the Amir, can actually just deal with it himself or has to deal with it himself. We have a few cases where a request to deal with something in the taxes is moved on to someone else. So now, how can we fit these petitions to government officials into well-known systems redressing injustice and guaranteeing subjects' rights? So now we get to this one. So there are two legal systems or legal procedures that have been associated with these delegations of cases and with petitions to government officials. So on the one hand is the Byzantine litigation system, or the so-called libelles procedure, and the other is, of course, al-nazar fil mazalim. So mazalim, or al-nazar fil mazalim, just means looking at, dealing with injustices. Tillier has done, Mathieu Tillier has done, worked a lot on it. And he makes this distinction between the mazalim court as an institution and the principle, the abstract idea of mazalim, of sovereign justice, dealing, guaranteeing justice for all the subjects as a duty for a ruler. And so he says, mazalim courts, we don't actually have them until the 11th century. Then we have specific descriptions of the procedures, etc., etc. Al-Mawardi gives a very nice extensive description. Before that, we have documents, we have some references in literary sources, but we can't really restore it or identify exactly how it went. But there is this concept, this idea of sovereign justice. As I said, the duty of a ruler to uphold justice and the possibility for any subject in a realm to find redress about experienced abuses. And he acknowledges that that idea, that abstract idea, that general idea probably existed earlier. But how to connect the two? So if we go to our text, I actually, in several places, I made these things red. So these are words, I already said it, Muslima, Haq, Ra'iya, Zulm, words like that, which I think are associated exactly with this, in this realm, with this idea of sovereign justice. Even though some of these ideas, like haq, we had dikaios in Arabic or in Greek, use in Latin is of course all the same idea. Like a subject has the right to, or haisenet, his right should be guaranteed. And if we have these kind of terms that are associated with the duty to uphold justice in a ruled area by the ruler and his representatives. But then the other interesting thing, I think, is from all this documentation, and remember again, this early documentation, so I'm not talking about the 9th century petitions, but especially these documents that report on the dealing with a complaint and the handling of a complaint. We have all sorts of expressions that occur again and again. So kind of fixed expressions representing also a fixed or established procedure. So we start most of these documents in which a case is delegated, start with expressions like akhbarani, dhakara li. So-and-so has reported to me, has told me, again, referring to this oral component, even though dhakara can of course also mean you report in writing, but I think it refers to the oral reporting on a complaint. But also expressions like bring the two together in front of you, same expressions used again and again, this apparently established procedure, istakhrij al-haq, bring out, give him his right, what he's entitled to. And so these expressions return again and again. And also, of course, as I already mentioned, Jeffrey has looked at other expressions that we find later in these petitions which are also totally standardized. So what do we have? We have fixed Arabic formulation with reference to the ruler's duty to provide justice for his subjects, which is later identified, of course, with this whole concept of nazar fil mazalim. So the fixedness of this procedure is my pointing to the institution, not called nazar fil mazalim, but obviously totally connected to it. So even though Tillier acknowledges, as I said, this general concept of nazar fil mazalim, even he mentions this, I think, very concrete, actually, reference that Abu Yusuf, when he writes this Kitab al-Kharaj for Harun al-Rashid at the end of the 8th century, puts in there that, according to him, a ruler should sit at least, I think he says 3 times or something, he should sit and receive complaints. But he doesn't connect this general concept to the papyri. And I think we can both have, as I said already, this concept of sovereign justice and the institution when we look at these documents. But I'm very much indebted to Tillier, who warns us that whatever this idea of mazalim is, procedures, they develop, they change through time and place. Now, the Byzantine libellus procedure. So this is very important. This is the litigation procedure, which Fournet has shown to have made some really important changes in the 7th century. So the litigation libellus procedure, how did it go? Very similar to what we find in our documents. By the 7th century, the complaint was made orally, in Coptic mostly, and then it was delegated to a lower official. Before that, it was done in writing with a petition, and then kind of like a case came where the plaintiff had to state what their arguments were, and then the defendant had to react to it, etc., etc. And we have court proceedings from these cases. But these disappear in the course of the 6th century, and in the 7th century, we don't have petitions anymore. We don't have these court procedures at the end of the 6th century already anymore. And we move to this totally oral procedure. And that's, of course, the same that we find in our Arabic documents. And this is, I think, so this, it's moved to an oral phase. Complaint is made orally, then transferred to a lower official who deals with the case in whatever way he wants. So actually, Fournet calls this withdrawal of state from the justice system. I don't know why, because it's still lower officials, it's the government. But of course, he compares it with like the Roman system and these court procedures, etc. So for him, this is like, chaos. But I think, as we saw in our documents, where we have, the same formulae, the same procedure, it's actually very well organized. Government officials are part of it. And I think it's also enforced. I mean, even better, like you're in the middle of the government officials. But I think it's why this oral component is why we don't have petitions like the ones I showed you from this very early period, because people made their complaint, they made their petition orally. It's only later that they start writing them up. And why this is, well, that's another question. But I think, so the only evidence we have is these letters in which the governor delegates a complaint, a litigation case brought before him to a lower court. We don't have, as I said, similar letters in which a governor delegates another kind of complaint, like we saw later appearing in petitions. But I'm sure that people made those kind of complaints or questions to government officials also in the earlier period. There were also immigrants, there were also widows, and they also turned or could turn to government officials to ask them to deal with it. But because these were done in spoken form and were not delegated anymore, we don't have written traces of them. That's what I think. So I just want, I just want to show really quickly this amazing letter, because this is a letter where a government official, it's the last one I'm showing, delegates again a case, a litigation case, to a lower official. But in this case, he's talking about all the, he doesn't just say, if the plaintiff can show that their entitled to what they claim, but he gives all the, he either has to do it by evidence or an oath, or, so they're all the, how say that? Evidence methods that could totally fly in a Qadi court, but we're not in a Qadi court. And so this is the really important point that I want to make so my last two slides. In conclusion, is that there is a correspondence and an influencing from these different realms of the law. They form one system, and they influence each other. So we have here a letter within the government public sphere, but it uses ideas, procedures that have been established in within a Qadi court context. So rather than when we think like, where do these documents fit and how do they fit with these different systems that we know of, Qadi court, Mazalim court, Byzantine petition or litigation procedure, I would like to look at it as a where did I put it? An evolving system that's connected. So when we think of petitions of state officials, people always turned with their problems to state officials. But what is important is that, so they took litigation cases, but also other cases. But what is important is that they didn't only take it to state officials. They could go to all sorts of other places. And this was, I think, also always the case. But at the same time, the system is never finished, right? The system where people can turn with their problems to things. It's a continuously evolving system, and that's what I meant. So you have, of course, the development of Muslim institutions. If we're talking about these first 2 centuries, administrative, governance, law, all these documentary culture, all these things go through different developments. But also in the petitioning process, or related to that. And we said before, in the beginning, there's oral petitioning, perhaps continuing a Byzantine practice. Then it moves to written petitioning. That's why we suddenly have these petitions. But it doesn't mean that before that, people didn't have these problems and didn't turn to the government officials with them. And the last important point that I want to make is that petitioners, the people who use the law, are as much involved in shaping it, in evolving the system, as the ones who are bringing top-down, are part of the top-down organization. So this is, so you have decrees, law codes, appointments of government officials. This is of course done by the government institutions or rulers, but you also have the people using the law, and they can go to many different things that are all part of it, I think, part of this legal system. And by deciding to go here, to go there, to move from one place to the other, to involve someone, to involve someone else, they're also shaping the legal system. So thank you for that. We started also a bit later.
No, thank you very much. Okay, the floor is open, and Neil, we have online audience as well, no?
Yeah, thank you very much. I enjoyed the talk tremendously. I learned a lot. I want to ask somewhat of a provocative question, but at the same time, it's also substantive. So the question is, how would you, given these documents that you've studied, given this time period that you've studied, how would you characterize the nature of state-society relations in this period of Islamic history? And I ask that because we have a depiction of Islamic history from some prominent historians, such as Bernard Lewis, who have written, and now I'm quoting him, the political history of Islam is one of unrelieved autocracy, where disobedience is a crime as well as a sin. And then he goes on to sort of paint a picture of, look, there were no, these things that you talk about, just to quote you, restitution of rights, abstract justice, sovereign justice, rights should be guaranteed, litigation process. That's not the picture that we see from prominent historians such as Bernard Lewis. So could you sort of speak to, based on your research, how would you characterize the nature of state-society relations based on what you've discovered?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I came to these documents and this research topic because I actually had this question: how come that the Arab conquests were actually really successfully turned into, from a conquest society into a empire? And we're always talking about the conquest. How did they manage to go from Atlantic Ocean to Indian subcontinent? But I think it's way more interesting to think about how did they manage to hold on to power, to establish themselves there for 300 years, if we say, you know, like, okay, pieces broke off, but more or less, you know, and even after that, you know, as we all know here, the Islamic Empire lived on in many ways. So and taking from empire studies, you cannot do that by force. You don't build a lasting, you can also not do it without force. So I think there are moments when disobedience is going to be punished. But of course, there's also constantly the debate about what is disobedience. What constitutes disobedience? In this one letter that I showed, the two guys who are sent by the governor to look into with bringing the letter which contains the complaints of the local taxpayers, they are furious. He's furious. He says, you know, don't come 1 minute late. Immediately when you get this letter, you have to come to me, and I'm bringing everyone in who has anything to do with this. You know, they're angry with what has happened and how these guys have behaved. But you saw that other letter. I mean, we don't know the whole story, right, as always with the papyri, but the other story, the other case, perhaps the complaining taxpayers are made to be silent. You know, you got a few bits and pieces, but now we don't want to hear about it anymore. So I think you can find both. No, but it's there, obviously, and there's many. I mean, not just in the idea of, as I say, sovereign justice and ideal kingship, you know, that exists. But I think you can also see it reflected in the day-to-day documents here, where people actually make day-to-day policy. So it's there. But yeah, but there were, as Annie knows very well, people were also chopped up and crucified at times. So it's not, yeah. But I think you're right that there's, you know, there's been less, but there is more attention for these kind of soft, if you can say, soft building of empire. But I think it's especially also interesting to bring in the inhabitants of the empire themselves, because they're part of it. And that's why I think these documents are so interesting, because it shows that, you know, whatever your problem was, there were ways of addressing it through government officials, to community leaders, to rich and powerful people in the street. So there were ways out of your problem, potentially.
Yeah, I appreciated the nuance and the dynamism of what was happening between government officials and people who had complaints. It wasn't just static, but there were sort of opportunities to press for your rights if you perceived there was injustice.
But it also doesn't mean, like, even in you know, our government should have fallen over one issue like that. It doesn't mean even when these things are in place that it's always implemented
right, of course,
fairly or something. Yeah. Thank you.
One thing intrigues me. Do we have examples from the Byzantine Empire of petitioning in the paper form? I would have thought we did, but I have absolutely no idea. So do you then have a thought about why we have paper petitioning and then we have paper petitioning in the early centuries of the Muslim Empire, and then we don't. Everything becomes oral, as far as you're saying. Do you have any observations on that?
Yeah, it's actually sorry that I wasn't. I mean, I went a bit fast at that point, but actually, so the model is lots of petitioning in the Roman period, extensive petitions in the 5th, 6th, from the 4th century, really elaborate into the 6th century. Then they disappear. Court proceedings disappear. So the idea is from Jean-Luc Fournet, especially, that then it moves into oral. And that seems to continue in the early Islamic period. And then in the 9th century, you get again, or 8th, 9th century, you get again paper petitions. So it's really the 6th, so 550, or sorry, 550 to say 700 or something. And his idea is that it's a effect of the languages in use in the Byzantine Empire. So Greek was the official language of the administration, but most Egyptians didn't know Greek. They spoke Coptic. So, but the court procedures, etc., had to be done in Greek. So he sees it almost as a kind of protest movement. They want to move to Coptic, and so they do it orally. They want to understand what's going on. Perhaps, there's something about the structures where Greek were implemented or maintained, breakdown of that. But so that it's the locals who kind of appropriate the petitioning procedure, and they do it then in spoken form. And that carries on then in the Islamic period. But of course, we know also, I mean, lots of things that come with the Arabs are, there's an emphasis on oral, even how evidence is constituted. The witnesses state their, what does state, how is that? A transaction, their statement that they witnessed the transaction is what constitutes evidence. So the oral element, is also something that comes with the Arabs. So the question is still, is this, I mean, I think it's so similar that there must be a continuation of Byzantine practice, but there's also something Arabian coming. All these terms that are so fixed, all these expressions that are so fixed. And, I mean, we also know lots of Byzantine influences already came to Arabia before the Arabs started the conquest. So that's also a way of, doesn't have to have happened in Egypt.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm just following up that point about oral. I mean, do you think, when there's this sort of, from the 3rd century, we started getting more petitions which seem to be represent sort of a shift to written petitions, and of course later into the Fatimid period. Do you think that this is, really what's going on perhaps is that there's an oral petitioning culture still in place? It's just that there's a sort of a dual, when it's being written as well as having an oral element. As you know, a lot of these petition formula often have a sort of like a virtual audience, about that, particularly in the Fatimid period. And sometimes their contents are rather sort of brief and difficult to interpret, like that petition I published. But of course, if it was accompanied by an oral and a petition at the same time, it was working on 2 levels, then it would make a bit better sense to interpret.
No, absolutely. So I think both the 2 elements are there most of the time. I mean, there does seem to be an exactly from the Fatimid period as well, but even there's this fantastic document first published by Margoliouth, and then Naim van Tichem did it again. So of these monks who have been abused by, I say that there have been some government officials who have outstayed their welcome. They come every year to the monastery, but this year they stayed too long and they ate everything, and then they also asked for extra money. And this seems to be, it's a very extensive document with all the information. You don't need extra information. There might still have been. So there's, again, I think there's a spectrum. So you have some that could work on their own. But I think absolutely the oral element was there, and probably still also in the 9th century, lots of complaints were made orally. There's a letter where someone says, actually, in the form of a petition, he says, I was allowed to come always to your house to ask for things. But now the Bawab and the guard, they don't let me in anymore. So please, can you tell them to let me in again? So yeah, he was doing it, I think, in spoken form. I don't know what he came. Did he came to ask for his annual, or is it at the feast days for extra alms, for food? But I don't know what he came. But so there's obviously still people always who come and make a claim without any writing. And I think that's also important in this early period. Yes, we don't have written petitions, but we have all this written reporting going on, which to some extent is also perhaps not superfluous, as we saw. You know, there's also, it also helps you to convey messages that you don't want to give to the people involved. But like, why does, in the very first one that we looked at, why does Iyas need to bring this letter that tells this other guy that he should look at her case? Why can't she just go to him and say, look, I've been to the governor of Jerusalem and he says you should deal with it. Of course, now we can say that, yes, because a letter helps you more, but in a, you know, in first of all, if it was all orality, then you wouldn't need that. So I don't think that's the case. But yeah, that's still a bit of a question. But I think, yes, so I think the two are always going to be there. Yeah.
Thanks, Petra. It's really interesting. I've got lots of questions. One of them is about Arabic-speaking involvement in Roman government in Syria before Islam. How far do you think that's significant? How far do you see the Ghassanids as involved in Roman administration, acting as administrators of justice?
Oh yeah, very, very important.
In the 6th century.
Yeah. So I think this is why I was saying, you know, where was the Byzantine model, if it is, or similarity, where did the Arabs adopt it? In Arabia, in Egypt, in the Levant, absolutely. And through whom is a big question. We have actually, I think it's from one of the Petra papyri, Greek, where actually it is also a settlement where Ghassanid Philarch is presiding over a conflict. So they are doing this, absolutely. I think the Petra, they are from the 6th century, so they're a little bit, you know, perhaps we are still in this court proceedings. I forget exactly what remind me that I should look at that, but the nature of that document. But yeah, no, they're independent of this case. There are absolutely indications that certain, for example, also administrative terms come from Byzantine Roman administrative environment, but not Egyptian. Sorry, they are introduced under the Arabs in Egypt, but they're not Egyptian Roman terms. And so they are Greek terms, but from the Roman background. So yeah, where I would say the Levant is the most obvious place where this comes from. So I'm not, yeah, Ghassanids, but in general, I think all these Arabs who were living there, some of whom I think joined the conquest of Egypt in this specific case. Even Ahmed Al-Jalad did very interesting work of how the Arab names in the Greek papyri from Nassana are different before the conquest and after. So there seems to be a shift of Arab population there, for example. I don't know where they went. They don't seem to have gone necessarily to Egypt, because there, as I understand from him correctly, the Arab names that appear in the Greek papyri are not exactly, I mean, because it's all about the dialect, the Arabic dialect that you can nicely see in the Greek, because the Greek writes vowels, no? So you can see the different, yeah, I'm not, yeah, so I'm not sure if it is that becomes too subtle, if you can see like the Jewites moving from Nasana to Egypt, but but they're definitely in Nasana, there seems to be a shift. So that's, so they went somewhere. And I think definitely there is some of that knowledge came along in the conquest, the areas that were enrolled.
I know we have questions online, but before we move online, we have one more question.
Can I just have?
You had one as well, no? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
My question is, how much is this an Egyptian phenomenon and how much is this a papyrus phenomenon? Partly because of the like the political and geography of Egypt in this period, which is sort of very rural and doesn't have massive cities. And does that create a particularly complex and sophisticated condition for the achievement of justice that isn't necessarily applicable elsewhere? And how much of the writing relies on, because papyrus isn't used elsewhere in this period with this rate.
I think it is used, but it's lost. I mean, in Egypt and to a certain extent Palestine, we have these because it's dry, or rather, in Egypt, you can only live near the Nile, so you throw your garbage. So that's why.
So it's kept, right? But even
or kept, it's preserved.
But like, there's papyri from Ravenna, like they were using it, but only up to the 6th. Early century, and even that's a sort of very late.
Yeah, but we have now this. Do you know of this papyrus? It's in, is it Latin script in Arabic in Latin script, or
From the BL.
Yeah,
Latin script with Arabic.
Arabic written in Latin script, right? And we still don't know where that came from.
No.
Somewhere in the Mediterranean, 9th century. Yeah. But is it Sicily, or like even from what what kind of environment would that have been created, right? Where are people using Latin script but move to or speak Arabic? So I think it is wider than we think. So let's first, how representative is it? So Jeffrey pointed out in when he looked at the development of petition formulae, that you have actually this very similar petition formulae in Sogdia, an Arabic document from Sogdia in Egypt. So, we don't have more, and that I think also in Al-Andalus, where there's preserved early traditions, very early traditions, and also early documentary formula, we also find it. So you can say, okay, that came through Egypt, but anyway, so we have like several different places where at least this petition formulae, and with it, I think the tradition, different from local traditions and local expressions, existed. So probably brought with the Arabs, but then we are in around 700. So what happened before that? For the Byzantine period, so we don't have, I should say we don't have evidence beyond what I just mentioned, that Abu Yusuf writes in 794 in Baghdad, oh, you ruler, you should sit and listen to your citizens coming to bring their grievances. So that is there. We don't know exactly, we have no idea what that meant, what it did. We know that there was a Sasanian idea of, listening to complaints. So is it part of indeed ideal kinship debates, or is this really happening? We don't know. But from the Byzantine period, you have these, of course, you have the law codes, and their references are made to these petition cultures. So in that sense, so I don't know for the Islamic period, we don't have the similar evidence, but in that sense, Egypt, its geography or whatever, would not make per se an exceptional case. But you're totally right. I mean, we have the literary descriptions are actually much richer about Mazalim courts, and they include for the Abbasid period already also people who come asking for money also. So not just litigation cases that we might think, or abusive government officials where we often associate it with, but also people who say, bad harvest, can I get some wheat? So in that sense, but again, that's of course literary text, which I think, you know, we should just incorporate. They're very valuable as well for understanding, but it's a different kind of evidence, of course. But I would have thought it's not unique to Egypt in that sense. Yeah.
Well, can you hold on to a question and get a question from our online audience?
Sure. Yasmin Amin says, thank you very much for a fascinating talk. The question asks about the outcome of these problems in terms of if we know the rulings that were issued and whether or not there was justice. She says you'd said things were fair. So that means presumably you know in some case there was a fair outcome. And she actually had a sort of sub-question, which was, did the implicit hierarchy of fiqh extend to the different categories of Christian, Jew, or Muslim testimony? Indeed, testimonies of women, in which regard, as we've seen a couple of examples, it's the woman herself who is writing rather than the guardian, the parent.
Yeah, well, this is of course, this is also something that's said later on about, I'm looking to you as if you asked the question, just look in the camera. One of the arguments made later by people of why people might turn to Muslim courts, which are often also used synonymously with the part of the Sharia called siyasa, so the administrative or the ruler's part of law giving, or what do you call it, justice giving, but which is an integral part with other forms of legal ruling. So why would people go there? Because in the Siyasa court or the Muslim court, other kinds of evidence are allowed, other procedures are allowed, and especially the court can do investigations, which of course the Qadi is not supposed to do. So this makes it attractive. So these, I mean, I have to say, I don't know exactly about all the rules of the Muslim courts later, but I can, so I don't know if these same rules, that women were subject to in other domains, whether they existed there to the same extent. But of course, more importantly is the period I was talking about was before that, precedes all that. So no, there's no evidence at all of, that's a striking thing. We have Christians or Jews, I mean, something raising their case in the same way that Muslims raise their case. Muslim officials, Christian officials deal with these cases of Muslims and of Christians. So that's not, these are not separated realms in that way. And what was the other thing about fair, or what was the outcome? I think well, when I was talking about the fair, it was more as a system as a whole or something, like how things were organized. But no, we don't know how it came out, because we just have the letter where the governor says, this is this guy's problem, find out whether he has a point, and if he has a point, give it to him. We don't actually have, I mean, the only thing was the first letter again, where the wife seems to not be satisfied with the solution and says, no, I wanna take it back. I wanna take it up again. So there we can see that the outcome was perhaps not to her liking, but that's it. Yeah.
We have, I have many questions, but we'll have time over dinner. But Paul, maybe we can end with Paul's question.
Yeah, thanks very much. I also thought it was fascinating. I just had a kind of comment and reflection on the question of writing and orality, and presumably there's a sort of performative element to writing as well, as sort of raises claims to a sort of more serious level, and also performs the sovereignty of the one who delegates. I was wondering, how easy it was. I mean, who actually wrote the manuscripts? I mean, was it an expensive thing to have a manuscript, to have a claim sort of committed to writing?
Yeah. So Yeah, thank you. No, I think the writing, I mean, it's really, yeah, Jeffrey and I were talking about it. I mean, there's also a prestige in oral performance, no, especially in the early Islamic period. So oral transmission, knowing, so, and even doing a speech or something. I was giving also this example in the diplomatic messengers coming. We have these accounts, diplomatic messengers coming from the Byzantine Empire or something, with a beautiful letter, but then the real thing is that they make their performative speech. You know, that's where it comes. So yeah, there is a performative element, but also I think you can find it in both oral and writing, orality and writing. Sorry, I had an answer for the second part, but now I don't remember.
Just about the cost or the kind of material.
Ah, yes. So yeah, so I was going to say, so Marina Rustov in her magnificent book, she talks a lot about how the writing of really big and spacious government decrees by the Fatimid administration was a sign exactly of showing, you know, their power. They could afford this, they could afford the very sophisticated writing, etc. And they could waste material. If you look at some of these early letters, the ones of Qura ibn Sharik, they are also actually they are quite large, and they are no, this is not Qura, but you see these administrative letters. They're very nicely written. They're spacious. These as well. This one especially. These are actually quite large and quite distinctive compared to especially these petitions later on. Well, this one is still quite nice, but they can become, you know, it differs a bit. Or perhaps the one that Jeffrey did, you can see. So there's definitely that same, I think, sending of messages with through written documents and nice, thin. The ones from Qura ibn Sharik, for example, all have the same size and the same width. So there's definitely something about the appearance of documents. The cost of papyrus, it's very difficult. The Roman papyrologists have mostly, or I said it, the Greek papyrologists, the ones from the class, have talked a lot about it. Of course, it depends also. If you're in the Delta, where it grows a lot, it's different from when you're in the oasis or somewhere. But it definitely, for example, we have some references also in the Arabic and also in the Greek where people say, excuse me for the fact that I'm reusing a papyrus. So that was obviously not really cool to do. But I also have some petitions, I think even this one, that are written on reused papyrus, where they don't say, sorry, I'm reusing papyrus. They just did. And I've been speculating, is that actually to emphasize how poor they are, that they have to reuse papyrus? Or is it just, actually it didn't matter so much? I don't know. I mean, a lot of documents are written on reused papyrus. Yeah, there's also some questions, like we have some documents where there are dates, and then it seems like actually papyrus was used for a long period. How you say that? Kept and then reused, where you also really wonder. I did an examination of some government documents that were used in a monastery, in the monastery of Balaiza, reused, and connected it to even perhaps trade in used papyrus. I mean, we have some references definitely to paper, trade in used paper. So yeah, it feels a lot of these elements, right? This information you can use to argue both, like, oh, it was very expensive, that's why they reused it, that's why they sold it, but also to the other side, like, you know, sometimes very insignificant little notes were written on a beautiful piece of papyrus. So I think it's very depends on the perhaps the place where you are, etc. I mean, there are some we have some prices, but not enough. Like when people say, "Can you buy me some tomar of papyrus or something like that, but yeah.
I mean, again, I have many questions,
Yeah.
but I'll postpone most of them for dinner. But there's a question that, oh, Neda left. I thought it would actually dovetail nicely with, I mean, maybe, and bring this to a close, but it's something, I mean, this is very thought-provoking to all of us, but for me, because I've worked on CIS and 19th century, but this is so familiar, the logic, the combination. But my question is about this word haq. And whether your sources, I take your point of thinking that the litigants are very much part of this legal system. It's not just from top down, and they shape it. And this business about mazalim emanating from the duty of the sultan, of the ruler, of the king to dispense justice. But if we take the point of view of litigants, and so where is this haq coming from? I mean, do your sources allow you to think about a possible answer for this question?
Well, in these ones where the case is delegated, it seems to me it comes from evidence. If you, however they do that, but it's establishing, you know, once certain information is given, then he should be given his haq. But sometimes people say also, in petitions, please do this for me because of my haq over you. You know, so there's also this idea of duty, of, you know, obligation is definitely also there. So, but I think in these ones, it's more this thing like, you know, it's a right that comes with having shown that you really have been abused.
So it's
like automatic.
It's connected to the evidence.
Yeah, and to the that's what
It's connected to the ability to show the evidence.
Well, in these specific cases, it seems to me.
So it's
Istikhraj haq.
It's procedural. I mean, but so I mean,
but then it's inevitable. Like once you've established that you've been abused, it's inevitable.
And this is where bayina, you know,
exactly.
you
show it.
You've shown it.
Yeah. I think so. This is what I think. Yeah. But it is, I mean, they used it, of course, in the same very concrete way when someone says, you know, he has you owe me so much, so I have a haq over you. And then I think it's really this much that you owe. Right? So it comes in different, but I think in these it's a, I mean, there is also this, I think Caroline also writes it in this article about legal pluralism in the late Roman Empire, the late article that she did, where she also states that, you know, for in Roman law, this is a given, like if you can establish your use, you should get it. Like it's your right. So in that sense, there is also a more abstract, you know, everyone has the right to show that what they are entitled to. Yeah.
Well, there's so much, but this is beautiful. Thank you so much, and please join me at the very end in thanking Petra.